The famous statesman Winston Churchill once said, "We shape our buildings. Thereafter, they shape us." It's a profound thought, isn't it? It speaks to the intimate, almost symbiotic relationship we have with our homes. We pour our hopes, our dreams, and our very identities into the spaces we inhabit. And in return, those spaces become a part of who we are. They are the silent witnesses to our lives, the backdrop to our triumphs and our sorrows. But what happens when a house resists that process? What happens when a building has its own history, its own will, a life that was there long before you arrived? What happens when it refuses to be shaped, and instead insists on shaping you into something you were never meant to? For one young couple, Liam and Chloe, what began as the quintessential dream of a new life became a slow, suffocating descent into a nightmare. They sought a home with history, but they found a place where history was a predator, lurking within the very structure of the building. Their dream home held a dark, ancient secret that threatened not just to haunt them, but to absorb them, to swallow them whole. This is the chilling story of Blackwood House, a place that wasn't just possessed by a ghost. It was the ghost. Our story begins with Liam and Chloe, a couple who could have been pulled from a catalog advertising new beginnings. They were fleeing the city, a relentless landscape of concrete and noise that had worn them down. They were tired of the anonymous, cramped apartments, the constant pressure, the feeling of living on top of thousands of strangers yet feeling utterly alone. They yearned for space, for quiet, for a place with roots that went deeper than a building's concrete foundation. They wanted a home with character, with a story etched into its bones, a place they could lovingly restore and make their own. And then, after months of searching, they found it. Tucked away on the outskirts of a town that time seemed to have forgotten, stood the Blackwood House. It was a grand, imposing Victorian relic, a testament to a bygone era of ambition and style. To any practical observer, it was a wreck. The paint was peeling away in long, sun-bleached strips, like shedding skin. The garden was a chaotic jungle of overgrown rose bushes and tangled weeds, choking the life out of what was once a manicured lawn. The porch sagged, and a few windows were boarded up, like blind eyes. But where most people saw only decay and daunting effort, Liam and Chloe saw a masterpiece waiting to be rediscovered. They were enchanted by the steep, dramatic gabled roofs, the intricate, hand-carved woodwork that clung to the eaves, and the sheer, magnificent size of the place. It was everything they had dared to dream of. The realtor, a thin, nervous man named Mr. Abernathy, whose eyes never quite seemed to settle, was almost comically eager to close the deal. He kept fidgeting with his tie and clearing his throat as he walked them through the dusty rooms. "She's a house with a lot of history," he mentioned, flashing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. A real local landmark. Liam and Chloe just beamed at each other. That was precisely what they wanted. The thick shrouds of cobwebs in the corners and the fine layer of dust coating every surface didn't deter them in the slightest. To them, these were just the layers of accumulated stories, a tangible past they couldn't wait to peel back. They were completely swept up in the romance of it all, envisioning themselves as the saviors of this forgotten beauty, imagining holiday dinners in the grand dining room and quiet evenings in the firelight. They were so blinded by their vision of bringing the old mansion back to its former glory that they failed to notice the realtor's haste, the way he never stepped too far into any room, the way his gaze kept flickering towards the dark upper floors. They had no way of knowing that the history buried in those walls wasn't the charming, gentle kind. It was a chilling, century-old obsession that had gone terribly wrong. The house wasn't just waiting for a new family to fill its empty halls. It was waiting for a chance to finally, after 100 years of suffocating silence, take a breath. Their first night in the Blackwood House was a scene of pure, unadulterated hope. They picnicked on the floor of the vast, empty living room, their voices echoing in the space. Pizza boxes and a bottle of celebratory champagne were their only furniture. They spread out blueprints and paint swatches, excitedly mapping out their future. Their words full of "we'll put this here," and "imagine how this will look." As the sun went down, the immense quiet of the countryside settled around them, a welcome change from the city's endless drone. But as the night deepened and their conversation dwindled, a profound silence fell over the house. And in that silence, they noticed it. A draft. This wasn't the ordinary chill from a loose window frame or a gap under a door. This was something different. It was rhythmic. It moved with a slow, deliberate cadence. It felt like a deep, almost inaudible inhale, followed by a long, soft exhale that didn't seem to blow past them, but to move through them. The sensation was deeply unsettling, as if the entire house were a colossal chest, slowly expanding and contracting around them. At first, they did what any rational person would do. They tried to explain it away. "It's an old house," Liam said, his voice a little too loud in the stillness. "It's just settling." He reasoned it must be the wind, caught in some forgotten chimney or a complex network of vents. But no logical explanation quite fit the perfect, steady rhythm, the almost biological quality of the air's movement. Over the next few weeks, the phenomenon didn't fade. It intensified. The breathing grew more distinct, a low, resonant sigh that seemed to be the house's resting state. And then other things began. Faint whispers seemed to ride on those strange currents of air. They were too quiet to be understood, like snippets of a conversation happening in another room, but they were undeniably there, just on the edge of hearing. Chloe was the first to experience the house's more menacing side. Sleep, which had once been a refuge, became a nightly torment. She began to suffer from horrifyingly vivid nightmares. In them, she felt utterly awake, her mind screaming, but her body was paralyzed, pinned to the bed. She described a crushing weight on her chest, a suffocating pressure so intense it felt like she was being held down, her breath stolen from her lungs. It was a textbook case of sleep paralysis, a phenomenon with a terrifying history in folklore. Across the world, for centuries, that same sensation has been blamed on a malevolent entity known as the night hag, a creature said to sit on a sleeper's chest to feast on their breath, on their life force. Liam, ever the pragmatist, tried to blame it on the stress of the move, on Chloe's overactive imagination. But even he was finding his rationalism wearing thin. He couldn't explain the pockets of intense, unnatural cold that would appear and vanish in the middle of a room. He couldn't shake the persistent, prickling feeling of being watched, even when he was completely alone. One afternoon, while working in the study, he heard a distinct footstep creak on the floorboard of the landing above, only to remember that Chloe had driven into town an hour earlier. The house wasn't just settling anymore. It was waking up, and it was making its presence felt. Before long, the subtle disturbances escalated into undeniable events. The small, dismissible things were no longer so small. Doors that they knew for a fact they had closed and locked would be found standing wide open. An object they'd left on a mantelpiece, a vase, a book, would suddenly be on the floor on the other side of the room, as if thrown by a phantom tantrum. The house had ceased to be a passive setting for their lives. It had become an active and increasingly hostile participant. That rhythmic breathing, once just a curiosity, now seemed to follow them from room to room, a constant, chilling reminder that they were not the only inhabitants. They weren't just experiencing a haunting. They were living inside a creature, driven by a fear that was quickly eclipsing their initial excitement. Liam and Chloe began a frantic search for answers. They spent days at the town hall, sifting through dusty archives, but the records were strangely incomplete. They found the original deed and the Blackwood family name, but little else. It was as if the town's memory of the house had been deliberately scrubbed. The locals were no help either. When asked about the Blackwood House, their faces would become blank masks. They would murmur vague pleasantries and change the subject, a silent, town-wide conspiracy of avoidance. The breakthrough they so desperately needed didn't come from a library or a historical society. It came from the heart of the house itself. One afternoon, while inspecting a loose floorboard in what was to be their master bedroom, Liam felt a peculiar hollowness beneath the wood. He worked a crowbar under the edge and pried it up. Beneath it lay a small, dark, hidden compartment, untouched for what looked like a century. And nestled inside, covered in a thick blanket of gray dust, was a leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with the elegant, cursive script of a man named Alistair Blackwood, the original architect and owner who had built the house in the late 1800s. As they carefully turned the brittle pages, they watched his confident handwriting devolve, becoming more and more frantic, the ink smudged with what looked like desperate haste. The journal revealed a horrifying truth. Alastair was not just an architect. He was a fervent student of mysticism and arcane rituals. He was obsessed with the idea that a building could be more than just wood and stone. It could be imbued with a spirit, made into a living vessel. His goal was to bind a powerful, protective entity into the very foundation of the house, creating an eternal guardian for his family line. But his hubris led to disaster. The ritual, performed in the house's final stages of construction, went horribly wrong. He had summoned something far older, far more powerful, and far more malevolent than he had ever intended. His journal entries shifted from academic curiosity to pure, unadulterated terror. He wrote of his desperate attempts to control the entity, culminating in a last-ditch effort to trap it within the frame of the house itself, binding its essence to the plaster, the lath, and the beams. His last entries were filled with chilling descriptions of the immediate aftermath. He wrote of how the house had begun to breathe, the agonizing rhythmic sound of the trapped entity's life force raging against its prison. Alastair had designed a second ritual, a rite of appeasement to keep the spirit calm, but a sudden and mysterious fire swept through the house, killing him and his entire family before he could ever perform it. The spirit was left trapped, its fury and pain festering for over a century, suffocating inside its own wooden cage. So, what do you do when you discover that you're not just living in a haunted house, but that you are living inside the ghost itself? When the walls around you are the ribs of a captive monster? We're about to find out. If you're finding this story as gripping as I am, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss the harrowing conclusion. The journal's final, terrified pages laid their situation bare. Liam and Chloe weren't just homeowners dealing with a poltergeist. They were squatters inside the tomb of a tormented, ancient spirit. The house's constant breathing was its breath. The cold drafts were its pain sighs. The whispers were its fractured consciousness. They understood now that every moment they spent within those walls, they were trespassers inside a living, suffering being. They realized they had only one terrifying option. They had to finish the ritual Alastair Blackwood had failed to complete over 100 years ago. It was an insane gamble, a desperate long shot based on the diary of a man who had dabbled in things best left alone. But it was the only hope they had. The journal provided a cryptic, almost poetic list of instructions. They needed a fresh egg, an ancient symbol of new life and potential. They needed salt for cleansing and protection. And they needed a single drop of blood from each of them, a living sacrifice, an offering to connect their own life force to the ritual. The entire rite had to be performed in the damp, cold stone cellar, the very foundation where the entity was first bound. Down in the darkness, after clearing away decades of grime, they found it, exactly where Alastair had described. A hexafoil, a daisy-like wheel of 6 overlapping circles carved into a foundation stone, an ancient symbol used across cultures to ward off evil spirits. As they descended the stone steps into the cellar, armed with the strange components for the ritual, the house seemed to sense their intentions. It began to fight back. The low, rhythmic breathing they had grown accustomed to swelled into a furious, roaring gale that howled through the entire structure. Upstairs, doors slammed with concussive force. The faint whispers that skittered at the edge of hearing twisted into guttural, enraged snarls that seemed to come from all directions at once. The temperature in the cellar plummeted, their breath pluming in the air. And that suffocating pressure Chloe knew so well from her nightmares descended upon both of them. A crushing, physical weight that made every step an ordeal. With hands that trembled uncontrollably, Liam placed the fragile egg in the center of the carved hexafoil. Chloe, her face pale with fear, poured a continuous circle of salt around it, her own protective boundary. Then, the final, most intimate step. They each pricked a finger with a small knife and watched as a single, bright red drop of their blood fell onto the egg's smooth, white shell. Taking a deep, ragged breath together, they began to chant the words from the journal. The passage wasn't a command or a banishment. It was an apology. They spoke of release from unintended bondage, of sorrow for the spirit's century of pain and isolation. It was an offering of peace, a plea for forgiveness directed at the furious, living soul of the house. The moment the final, whispered word of the chant died in the cellar's oppressive silence, everything changed. The roaring wind ceased so abruptly it left their ears ringing. The crushing pressure on their chests vanished, leaving them lightheaded and gasping. The intense, bone-deep cold faded, replaced by a profound and unnerving stillness. For a long, terrifying second, nothing happened. They stood frozen, staring at the blood-marked egg in the circle of salt. And then, a sound began to echo through the house. A deep vibration that traveled up from the stone floor and into their very bones. It was one final, gargantuan, shuddering exhale. It was a sigh that seemed to carry with it all the pain, rage, and loneliness of 100 lost years. The sound groaned through the timbers of the house, and a fine shower of dust drifted down from the ceiling. And then, absolute silence. The breathing was gone. The presence was gone. For the first time since they had set foot in the house, the Blackwood House was just a house. It was still, it was quiet, and it was wonderfully, blessedly empty. Utterly drained, physically and emotionally, Liam and Chloe stumbled back up the cellar stairs. They had faced something ancient and impossible, and somehow, against all odds, they had won. They truly believed they had finally succeeded where Alistair had failed. They had either set the tormented spirit free, or soothed it into a final, eternal sleep. The house, at long last, was theirs. Weeks turned into a month, and the silence held. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by a sense of peace. Liam and Chloe slowly began to heal from their ordeal, and in turn, they began to heal the house. They repaired the damage from its violent outbursts. They painted the walls in warm, bright colors, and they filled the once dreaded rooms with light, music, and laughter. The Blackwood House was finally, miraculously, becoming the dream home they had always wanted. The nightmare, it seemed, was over, but it wasn't. One quiet evening, Liam was in the master bedroom, patching a web of fine plaster cracks on the wall, the very same wall that concealed the compartment where they'd found the journal. It was a mundane, satisfying task, the final touch in reclaiming their space. As he smoothed the wet plaster with his palm, he felt it, a faint, rhythmic vibration against his hand. It was so subtle, so deep within the structure, that at first, he dismissed it as his own pulse throbbing in his fingertips. But he held his hand still, and the vibration continued. It was slower than his own pulse, deeper, more powerful. His heart began to hammer in his chest, a frantic counterpoint to the slow rhythm in the wall. A cold dread, horribly familiar, washed over him. With a sense of grim inevitability, he pressed his ear against the cool, fresh plaster. And he heard it, faint, distant, muffled by wood and lath and a century of secrets. But it was there. There was no mistaking it. Thump, 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 thump. The slow, steady, and impossibly vital beat of a heart. The ritual hadn't worked the way they thought. The horror of the realization crashed down on him. Their offering of blood, their own living essence, hadn't appeased the spirit. It had anchored it. It had nourished it in a new and far more terrifying way. They hadn't freed the house's captive breath. They had given it a heart. The house was no longer just breathing. Now it was truly horrifyingly alive, and they were trapped inside it, their own life force now a permanent part of its monstrous, beating anatomy. So what would you do if you discovered your home wasn't just haunted, but had a living, beating heart in its walls? What's your next move? Is there a survival plan for that? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And for more stories that explore the terrifying space where folklore and reality bleed together, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.